Hello and welcome to Poleasy, the series that's all about making learning policy debate easy. This is our Introduction to Policy Debate series, specifically tailored to helping novices or just people new to policy debate learn the format. This fifth part is going to be all about learning topicality, an off-case argument presented by the negative. If you haven't watched the earlier parts about the essentials of policy debate, aff and neg basics, and then disadvantages, I highly suggest that you watch those first because they all kind of lead into this concept. But with that being said, first, what exactly is topicality, also shortened to T? So, topicality is an off-case argument presented by the negative in the first negative constructive, or 1NC. A topicality argument claims that the AF's plan is not an example of the resolution and therefore does not affirm it. And if the negative can prove that the plan is not topical, they win the topicality stock issue, taking out the second leg of the AF stool. So topicality comes first in a policy debate. It is the most important argument to the judge. And it's also a no-risk issue for the negative because it cannot be turned into an AF voter. The idea is it doesn't matter how cool your 360 dunk shot looked if it happened out of bounds. So before the judge determines whether or not the plan is a good idea, they have to determine whether or not it's part of the resolution in the first place. So topicality is a very important argument. And a topicality argument has 5 parts, which we will go over more in depth in this video: interpretation, violation, standards, voters, and framework. So we will explain this through Bob, Sally, and hide and go seek, an analogy for topicality. So Bob represents the affirmative and Sally represents the negative, whereas hide and go seek represents debate as a game. So first, I want to show you just some of my gorgeous illustrations to help kind of get the concept to make sense in your brain before we go over them more specifically. So first off is the interpretation. So an interpretation would be Sally saying that Bob should hide inside the house. So Sally's the negative, Bob is the affirmative. Second is the violation. So Bob hid outside the house behind the tree instead of inside the house. Third is standards. So you would say that hiding outside the house increases the number of hiding places by too much and also takes away counting spots from Sally. And then fourth is voters. So Sally might say that Bob should lose because the way that he was playing the game was cheating and didn't help Sally learn from the game. So now let's break down those pieces more individually. First in topicality is the interpretation. So the interpretation is what you believe a word or phrase in the resolution should mean. Topicality argues that the AF plan is not an example of the resolution, and the interpretation shows what examples of it should look like. In the hide and go seek analogy, the interpretation would be Sally telling Bob to hide inside the house. So second part of topicality is the violation. So the violation is the part of the affirmative plan that does not fall under the interpretation. Topicality argues that the AF plan is not an example of the resolution, and the violation is how they prove it. So in the hide and go seek analogy, the violation would be Bob hiding outside the house behind a tree. So if the interpretation is the rule, the violation is where you show that they broke the rule. Topicality part 3 is standards. So standards are reasons why the negative's interpretation is good and should be used. So topicality argues that the AF plan is not an example of the resolution, and then standards show why being part of the resolution is going to create a good debate round. So if interpretation is the rule, violation is how you broke the rule, standards are why the rule exists. Why is the rule important? And there are 2 standards on topicality. The first one is limits, and limits basically says that your interpretation keeps the topic from getting too big or too many AF cases for the negative to prepare. Because if you remember, the resolution is a really, really, really big topic, and the negative has to be ready for whatever the affirmative might say because they don't get to choose what the debate is about. So you argue that if the topic is already so big and it's already so hard to prepare to be negative, that the affirmative has to be part of the topic, because if they're not part of the topic, then the negative will never be ready to answer their plan. The second argument is ground, and ground says that the interpretation ensures both sides have equal access to high quality arguments in the debate round. So the reasons why bringing me a Dr. Pepper is a bad idea are completely different than the reasons why bringing me a puppy is a bad idea. So if the affirmative isn't topical, then your arguments that you've prepared as the negative aren't going to apply. So in the hide and go seek analogy, limits would be saying that Bob increases the number of hiding spots by too much, so it's impossible for Sally to be able to find him. And then ground would be Bob saying that, or Sally saying that Bob is taking away places for Sally to count at. So the fourth part of topicality is voters. The voters are reasons why topicality is a serious enough argument that it should be the first thing that the judge votes on. So if topicality is arguing that the affirmative plan is not an example of the resolution, the voters prove why that means the affirmative should lose the debate. So if the interpretation is the rule, the violation is how you broke the rule, the standards are why the rule matters, the voters are reasons why breaking the rule means that you're disqualified. And there are two voters. The first is fairness, where you basically say that debate is a game where both teams should have an equal chance to win, but being untopical makes it easier to be AF because the negative isn't going to be able to debate you as well. And then second is education, which is to say that in order to learn from debate as an educational activity, you have to be prepared. But when the affirmative is untopical, it makes it harder for the negative to be prepared. So in the hide-and-go-seek analogy, voters would be Sally claiming that the way that Bob played the game made it easier for him to win and harder for her, while also taking away her ability to learn from the game, so he should lose. The fifth and final part of topicality is framework. So the framework tells the judge how they should evaluate topicality arguments. The framework for policy debate in general is something that we learned all the way back in the first video. It's all about stock issues. So the framework for policy is if the affirmative wins the stock issues, they win the debate. If the negative wins one, they win the debate. So topicality also has its own frameworks that can be used to judge it, and there are two: competing interpretations for the negative and reasonability for the affirmative. So competing interpretations, which is what the negative will argue, says that the judge should look at every definition of a word or phrase in the topic that is presented to them in the debate, choose the best one, and then vote negative if the affirmative does not meet that best interpretation. So in the hide-and-go-seek analogy, Sally and Bob are asking Alex, their parent, to make a decision on who won the game of hide-and-go-seek. Sally says that Alex should listen to her and Bob's different boundaries for hiding, then pick the best set of boundaries, and then decide if Bob followed those rules. And if he didn't follow those rules, then he should lose. So topicality and disadvantages are actually kind of similar in their structure. So think of topicality as a disadvantage to how the affirmative chose to do debate when they read this plan. The interpretation is like uniqueness. If people did this, followed our interpretation, or stayed on the cliff, then everything would be fine. The violation is like a link. Here's what you did differently to push us off the cliff. The standards are like internal links. After being pushed, we fall for a little while. And then the voters are like the impact. It's why the argument matters. And then framework is like impact calculus. How should the judge weigh arguments from both teams? So there are also two other common forms of topicality. The first form is extra topicality. Extra T argues that the plan does the resolution, but also goes beyond the resolution, which is bad because it makes the topic too big to prepare for, and everything outside the topic is supposed to be negative ground. And then there's effects topicality, which says that the plan doesn't actually implement the resolution, it implements something that is likely to result in resolutional action. So if the resolution was, you should bring Coach Smith a drink, and then your plan was, let's bring Coach Smith a puppy and a drink, that would be extra topical. Whereas if you were like, oh, let's bring Coach Smith a couple of apples that he could turn into juice, that would be effects topicality. You're not bringing me a drink, you're bringing me something that might turn into a drink. So on the example resolution, students should bring Coach Smith a drink. What if the plan was students should bring Coach Smith a cheeseburger? So an example topicality argument would be that the word drink means liquid. So interpretation, the word drink in the resolution means a liquid meant for nutritional consumption. 2, violation, the plan brings Coach Smith a cheeseburger, which is not a liquid. 3, standards, limits, there are already so many drinks to prepare for, and adding all types of food to that list makes being negative against this topic impossible. Ground, arguments about why drinks are bad, like empty calories or having to pee, don't apply to food plans, which takes away our ground, takes away our arguments to read against them. 4th is voters. Fairness, you can't objectively determine who did the better debating if both teams didn't start on an equal playing field. And then being untopical makes the debate unequal. B is education. The primary purpose of debate is to teach us communication skills and about the topic area. Being untopical takes away that education. Lastly is framework. Evaluate topicality on competing interpretations. You should vote for the team that defends the best possible version of the topic. So this is an example topicality argument putting all of the pieces together. So how does the affirmative answer topicality? Well, there are 5 steps to answering topicality, not a disadvantage. That's a typo. So first is counterinterpretation. You answer the negative's interpretation of the resolution with an interpretation of your own. So you need to offer a different and better way of defining the topic that does include your plan. And it has 3 parts. A definition, so you read a different definition. A we meet, so you prove that your plan is part of the new definition that you're reading. And then counter standards. So you need to provide reasons why your counter interpretation is good. So, resolved, Bob should hide at Sally's house. Sally decides that her interpretation is that at is in. Plan, Bob should hide behind the tree in Sally's yard. So Sally is saying that behind the tree is not inside, so Bob is not topical. Bob's counterinterpretation is that at means in or around. He said that he does follow that rule because the tree is around her house, and that this rule is better because Sally's house is too small. So the second way you answer it is with a we meet argument. The negative says that you should lose the debate because you didn't follow their definition. So your next response needs to prove that you didn't violate their interpretation in the first place. This is called a we meet argument, as in we meet your interpretation. So in hide and go seek, Sally's interpretation was that Bob must hide inside Sally's house. Bob says, I meet your interpretation. I am hiding inside your property. So third is standards defense. You need to answer the standards that they gave for their interpretation because they say that they're important for good debates, and you need to disprove that. So for limits, you can argue that including your plan doesn't make the topic too big, or that their interpretation makes the topic too small, which is called over-limiting. So Bob might argue that there are only 2 hiding spots outside, so he doesn't increase the number of hiding spots by too much. And then on ground, you need to argue that including your plan as part of the topic doesn't take away too many of their arguments, or that it takes away too much of yours. So Bob argues that Sally can look from inside of the house at the outside and vice versa, so she didn't lose counting places. And then fourth response is that you should say that there needs to be actual versus justifiable voting issues. So the negative, their fourth part of topicality is voters. They say that topicality is the most important voting issue in the round because it protects fairness in education. You need to argue that this means the judge should only vote on topicality if the negative can prove that fairness in education were actually damaged in the debate, not that they potentially could have been damaged. So Bob argues that Sally could have easily seen Bob by looking out the front window, so she still had an opportunity to win and learn. So you should never, ever, 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 ever say that topicality is a reverse voting issue. This basically says that if the affirmative wins topicality, they should win the whole debate. But Bob says that if he proves he didn't cheat, he should win the whole game, even if Sally did find him. Basically, topicality is a check to make sure that the affirmative didn't break the rules. Proving that you didn't break the rules is not enough to win the game, but if you did break the rules, it is enough to lose the game. So topicality cannot be a reverse voting issue. Fifth and finally is framework, or reasonability. So the negative has argued that the judge should pick the best definition of the topic presented to them and then vote negative if the plan doesn't follow it. So that's competing interpretations. But topicality is supposed to prevent abuse. So if your plan wasn't abusive, why do you have to be part of the best definition of the topic? So the affirmative should argue that the judge evaluates topicality on reasonability. Did the affirmative plan make a reasonable interpretation of the topic presented in the debate? And if they did, they shouldn't lose. You should also say that competing interpretations is a bad framework. So Bob might say that his rules didn't break the game, so even if Sally's rules are better, he shouldn't be disqualified by Alex. So now let's do an example of answering topicality. So the 2AC should always make counterinterpretation, we meet, and reasonability arguments. So if the resolution was students should bring Coach Smith a drink, and then the plan was about bringing me a cheeseburger, the negative might say interpretation. Drink means liquid meant for nutritional consumption. And then the affirmative says counterinterpretation. Definition, drink includes anything that comes with it. We meet, a cheeseburger comes with a drink usually. Counter standards, our definition is more real world. So then violation, a cheeseburger is not a liquid. We meet their interpretation. A cheeseburger has ketchup, mustard, and mayo on it, which are all liquids meant for human consumption. They say standards limits food and liquid. If you include food and liquid, the topic is too big, and ground disadvantages to liquids don't apply to food. You could say that actually on limits, only fast food comes with drinks, so we're not making the topic too big, and ground reasons why drinks are bad also apply to food, like high calories. Lastly, on voters' fairness in education, you respond by saying that you should only vote on actual, not potential abuse. And then framework, they say you should evaluate topicality and competing interps. You say you should evaluate topicality on reasonability because it helps protect the negative from unfair plans, but unlike competing interpretations, it doesn't turn policy debate into definition debate. So that is the end of this 5th part of the Poleasy Introduction to Policy Debate series, all about topicality. Hopefully this video was useful for you, and I will see you next time.